It's my pleasure to introduce Nicholas Johnson. I knew him when he was the boy wonder of Washington, D.C. He was appointed head of the Federal Maritime Administration at age 29 by President Lyndon Johnson. And not long after that, he was appointed to the Federal Communications Commission, where he became the all-time dissenter, the writer of commentary. I remember one of his books was called Talking Back to Your TV Set, where he basically reversed the dynamic and said, what about the First Amendment rights of the audience, not just of the broadcasters? Later confirmed in a famous court case called the Red Lions case, Federal Court of Appeals. He came out of Texas, born in Iowa, came out of Texas, University of Texas Law School. He held 3 presidential appointments, and the Yale Biographical Dictionary of American Law describes Nick Johnson as one of the 700 leading figures in the history of American law from the colonial period to the present day. He's been an author, a TV host, High Tech Times on PBS, you may remember, he hosted, public lecturer, radio commentator, syndicated columnist, congressional candidate, and co-director of a Public Health Institute. He's also school board member in Iowa. He teaches a course at the University of Iowa Law School on the media. I'll give you Nicholas Johnson.
Yes, my name is Nicholas Johnson, and I'm not running for anything. I thought you'd appreciate that. What you see here is my old FCC uniform. I would have come with the long hair and the shaggy beard and the cowboy mustache, but there wasn't enough time to grow all that hair. And so I just got me this Bernie Sanders haircut instead and decided I'd go with that. And having known and worked with Ralph and all of his family members for the past half century, it's a great pleasure to be able to share this commemorating conference with them and you and those watching this on the real news. He's asked that I say something about the origins and values of the American broadcast regulation system, its demise, and the past efforts of media reformers, to which I'm going to add some thoughts on the options open to us in the 21st century. Because I am used to speaking for entire semesters at a time, my challenge this morning is putting all of this into my allotted 20 minutes. So here goes. Long ago, in a galaxy far away, while European countries were choosing government ownership of things like railroads and telephone systems, Americans chose private ownership, modestly restrained by government regulation. And so it was to be with broadcasting. Most countries went the way of the BBC, ultimately a nonprofit public corporation. Its first leader, Lord Reith, set the BBC's public service standard, quote, programming all that is best in every department of human knowledge, endeavor, and achievement. He created the equivalent of our fairness doctrine, and a BBC as independent of commerce as it was of government, be funded by fees from the listeners and ultimately viewers. Japan's NHK, Sweden's Sveriges Radio, and other countries followed this model. Today's Corporation for Public Broadcasting here is the American version. Now, in the 1920s, as the sales of radio receivers accelerated to 100 million, so did the number of stations increase, and their signals interference made intelligible reception difficult to impossible. as has so often been the case, it was the broadcasters who came to government asking for regulatory relief. Government licensing was seen as a solution to chaos. Now, of course, there was a little added benefit, the elimination of competition. But what can you do? That's going to happen. Then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who you may have remembered from later in history, responded to their request by calling a series of radio conferences. And from them came the recommendations that ultimately became the Radio Act of 1927 and then the Communications Act 1934. It was the usual American compromise between the ideology of private ownership and the pragmatism of regulation through licensing. But the values at the foundation of the act, which were shared by broadcasters, government, and the public alike, were very similar to those of Lord Reith. His public service standard became the commission standard for the granting, renewal, or revocation of licenses. That radio programming must serve, quote, the public interest. Even broadcasters tended to agree with Secretary Hoover's comment, echoing Lord Reith's judgment, when Hoover said, quote, "It is inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility for service, for news, entertainment, and education to be drowned in advertising chatter." Lord Reith's preference for public over private ownership was reflected in the House floor debate about the Radio Act, as Congressman Luther Johnson warned his colleagues, quote, "American thought and politics will be at the mercy of those who operate these stations. If placed in the hands of a single selfish group, then woe be to those who would dare to differ with them." I thank you for Luther Johnson. Ultimately, the language of the act began, quote, "It is the purpose of this act to maintain the control of the United States over all the channels of radio transmission and to provide for the use of such channels, but not the ownership thereof. Without an FCC license, a studio and transmitter and antenna had little more than scrap value. But with that license, they were worth millions. Moreover, the FCC told the licensee where it could build, set its minimum and maximum hours, its transmitter's power, the direction of its signal. There were limits on how many licenses one could hold, maximums on advertising, and required minimums of educational and cultural programming, news, public affairs, and public service announcements. The Commission's 1946 Blue Book simply provided more detail. Thus, FCC licensees were owners in name only, with little more discretion than government employees or contractors might have had when using the public's airwaves, sort of like a fast food or motel franchisee. When I arrived at the Commission a half century ago, the FCC was supposedly still regulating broadcasters according to standards at least similar to those of the 1920s and 30s. But in Washington, like most industries, broadcasting had its own sub-government. Dominant corporations, their lobbyists, a trade association, trade press, an eating club, agency employees, legislators and their staff, and a bar association for the communication lawyers, all of whose futures and fortunes turned on successfully protecting their circled wagons. Moreover, the money in this politics flowed upstream. Other industries had to pay to play. They gave the so-called campaign contributions to seek favor with elected officials. The reverse was true for the broadcasting industry. Elected officials gave most of their campaign contributions to the broadcasters. And the time and attention that the broadcasters were selling to politicians was something they could also give for free. So if the broadcasters were not successful in winning over the FCC commissioners and staff with private chats, free meals, receptions, golfing outings, and the prospects of future employment, they could always get what they wanted or prevent what they didn't want by going to their friends on Capitol Hill. As a result, I discovered, no matter how outrageous a broadcaster's performance might have been, the likelihood of a license not being renewed was so rare as to be indistinguishable from never. Rules were, thank you very much, it's a tough crowd, but I appreciate that. Rules were adopted and then waived. Congressman Luther Johnson's warnings about private power had been long since forgotten as merger after merger was approved. And that and more was what motivated me to write some 400 separate opinions during my term. Charged with unfairly picking only the worst cases, I co-authored a Yale Law Journal article titled, courtesy of the Beatles, A Day in the Life. And in it, we itemized an entire week's agenda, selected at random, and demonstrated how every decision that week left much to be desired. My term coincided with a citizen activist period in American history. Ralph Nader's Raiders consumer organizing, anti-war groups protests, civil rights legislation, Black Power demands, the women's movement, protest songs, and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. In such times, it was inevitable that failures of the media, as well as the Commission and the Congress, would ultimately lead to the creation of a media reform movement as well. As I put it at the time to all who would listen, whatever is your first priority, your second priority must be media reform. It took a variety of forms. Al Kramer's Citizens Communication Center provided the legal support for hundreds of media reform groups in communities across the country. Stations' license renewals were challenged for failure to serve their local communities or discriminatory employment practices. Some groups wanted to save classical music stations. Others created community or even illegal pirate radio stations. Video portapacks, the predecessor of today's ubiquitous smartphone videos, led to the interest in video art, guerrilla television, video activism, and what became cable television's public access channels. Foundations and donors were willing to provide at least minimal financial support for these efforts. And because the uprising had kind of caught the media establishment off guard, there were a few years of media reform Camelot. Following this, as at least some of you have lived through, the swamp waters returned. Many in the establishment made a sharp right turn to follow Grover Norquist. As he put it, "I'm not in favor of abolishing the government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where we can drown it in the bathtub." And drown it they did. At the FCC, this took the form of what was variously called re-regulation, or more accurately, deregulation. License terms were lengthened. Restrictions on maximum station ownership were reduced to the point of non-existence. The commission would not even acknowledge that a license renewal challenge had been filed, let alone address it. And seldom, if ever, did a merger fail to meet the commissioner's definition of the public interest. As the fickle foundations focused on a new squirrel and lost interest, media reform organizations lost their funding. The courts lost their appeal. The Congress and Commission lost their sense of hearing. Which brings us to this day in May of 2016. What are we to make of the Tea Party, the Occupy movement, and the millions of aware and angry Americans following Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders? Are we on the cusp of another burst of media reform revolution, enthusiasm, and possibility? There's your voices. Okay. So using the name of our day at this 4-day conference, what can we do to break through the media? It would be nice if we could wrap up today with an easily remembered list of the 5 things you can do to improve the media. But it's not so simple. There are even more than 5 categories of things progressive activists can do before we start listing specific tasks, let alone trying to revigorate the FCC. Here are a few with illustrative examples. Destination. Let's start with the obvious. What's your goal? How would you know if you or your organization was ever successful? As the old line has it, if you don't know where you're going, the odds are very slim you'll ever get there. In what specific ways do you wish the media were different, and why? Are you trying to increase contributions or members for your local organization and think positive column inches in the paper will help? Or are you trying to improve our political campaigns and the public officials they produce? And your goal is to raise the entire American electorate's interest in articles and programming about the daily diet of policy wonks. Opportunity. The lack of a legal right does not remove all opportunity. The Supreme Court has given media owners legal control of content, but as we've recently observed, one can even win the presidential nomination of a major American political party without paying for broadcast time or newspaper space. Progressive causes do not always do all they could to promote their efforts with public radio and television. Even commercial media offer us opportunities with op-ed columns and letters to the editor in newspapers, guest appearances on television, calls to radio talk shows, developing relationships with editors, producers, journalists, and on-air personalities, making use of free kiosks, store windows, and bulletin boards. Education. There's something to be said for the suggestion, if you really want to improve the quality of American media, start by spending more public money on K-12 and higher education. Specifically, in our case, media literacy. If the media consumer can't tell the difference between the junk news in ABC's evening program and the truly significant, there's little more we can do. Then there's the question of what do we mean by media? We now have the social media to consider, and they've required the redefinition of journalist. Should it include everybody with a web page, blog, email list, Facebook, or Twitter account? Even more significant is that this increased diversity and quantity of communication brought with it a demise of the wealthy newspapers that formerly provided the electronic media with content. TV no longer offers a 21st century version of your grandparents' Walter Cronkite, the most trusted American. It no longer provides a huge swath of the citizenry, a shared body of consensus-building quality journalism each evening. And the resulting political polarization has paralyzed the Congress and prevented compromise. According to a recent TED Talk, it's even reprogrammed our brains. Alternatives. Are foundations and nonprofits a part of the answer? The Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism is filling some of the void in my home state. Created and run by Lyle Muller, a quality former editor of a major Iowa paper, Iowa Watch is making investigative pieces available to Iowa papers. What could we do to encourage our fellow citizens to volunteer to cover a beat that no longer has a journalist? Regulation. It's unlikely we'll soon return to the micromanaging of the 1920s through 50s, nor would it make as much difference if we did, because there's so much of audio-video content coming to Americans now from the internet, web pages, podcasts, YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, and independent cable programming producers. But that doesn't mean that the old media are devoid of influence. The FCC and Congress are still potential forces worth encouraging to support our efforts, as we've attempted, for example, with maintaining network neutrality. What we do to use and strengthen the Freedom of Information Act or whistleblower protection are also a form of government support of journalism. I might even offer what Donald Trump would call suggestions that we consider reinstating a modified fairness doctrine, at least as a shared value, and conceptualize an antitrust principle regarding media mergers that goes beyond the economic marketplace to the marketplace of ideas. Even private regulation, in quotes, can have some impact, as with the successful effort to reduce television violence in the 1970s by the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting, Project Censored, of which you'll hear more later, the Minnesota News Council that operated for 41 years. I think the Academy can contribute much more than it has in terms of professors' scholarships, seminars, and doctoral dissertations. And of course, we'll all want to join in with Ralph's latest venture in breaking through media's power, called simply Voices. Well, there's much more to say, but no more time to say it. And so I thank you for your attention and very much look forward to the rest of the presentations at this historic conference. And now I bring you, star of stage and screen, former FCC Commissioner Michael Copps.
I'm Mike Copps. I apologize, first of all, for not being with you in person today. Had it not been for a long ago commitment to be overseas this week, I would be there. I would dearly love to be a part of this celebration of the 50th anniversary. I'll be there to salute my friend Ralph Nader, who has done so much for consumers and citizens and the common good, and to help launch the Breaking Into Power program. To me, breaking into power means, first of all, breaking into media. Without a media that reflects the American people, diversity of the American people, and provides real news and information, there's not going to be any reform in this country, and there's not going to be any enhanced democracy in this country. News and information, as George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson realized long ago, is the lifeblood of self-government. Without an informed citizenry, there can be no successful self-government. And I think no matter what your reform is, and I understand there are lots of different reforms that are represented in this audience today, those reforms just aren't going to go as far as they should without a media that tees up the issues, reports the facts, and nourishes a civic dialogue with the American people. Let me give you a little tale from experience. When I went to the FCC back in 2001, I thought, wow, this is totally cool. This is the coolest job in town, maybe in the country. I'll be dealing with all the edge of the envelope issues. I'll be meeting all the movers and shakers and innovators and technologists and entrepreneurs who are changing our world through telecommunications, and I'll be a part of bringing telecommunications to every citizen in the United States of America, as the 1934 Telecommunications Act required. So I happily got sworn in and showed up at the office, and what I found in the first week was that wasn't the job I had. The job I had was entertaining an unending stream of big media CEOs coming into my office and explaining why their latest merger, their latest effort to gobble up a community station, a local station, an independent station, was good for America. It was going to produce all kinds of efficiencies and economies, was really going to be great. And the FCC back in those days almost automatically approves those mergers and still approves the vast majority of those kinds of mergers right up until this day, I think at great cost to the American people. You know, you have to finance these big mergers. So the first thing these companies do once the deal is consummated is go out, close down newsrooms, or at least combine newsrooms, fire reporters. We've probably lost a third of the newsroom reporters in the United States of America in the last 30 years. It shows. Damp down real investigative journalism in the process. Investigative journalism, I think, hangs by the slenderest of threads nowadays. Infotainment has replaced factual journalism. Investigative journalism, homogenization has replaced diversity, and our civic dialogue has been, as someone once remarked, seriously dumbed down. When I was there at that time in the early 2000s, the internet was just starting off. And I think some of the folks then thought, well, what difference does it make what happens to radio, to television, and cable? Those are all technologies that are about to be consigned to the ash can of history. We've got the internet. The internet's coming, power at the edges. It's immune from all of the laws of consolidation and combination that we've seen. Laissez-les bon temps rouler, let the good times roll. And I think that attitude got in the way of us getting some real media reform back then. Fast forward, though, a few years, last couple of years, and I think most Americans now understand that the internet's going down the same road that radio and television and cable went down, subject to gatekeeping, consolidation. You've got a few big media companies, a few big telecommunications companies, and big ISPs, and sometimes they're all within the same corporate structure. No model for support of real investigative journalism. The internet has not begun to replace the news and information that's been lost in traditional media. So we really have a problem there. And I know we had a victory with net neutrality at the Federal Communications Commission. As I record this, it's not definite which way the court is going to go on that, but I would like everybody in this audience to realize that net neutrality is not the end of the debate over the future of the internet. It's kind of the prologue or the preface, because all of these questions about how do you protect the public interest on the internet, which is where we're all going to live and work and get our information from and take care of our health and educate ourselves and educate our kids, how is that going to be managed so as to serve the public interest? So we have some huge choices to make in this country that go far beyond, range far beyond net neutrality. So what can we do about it? This is a group of activists, organizers, and reformers who know that we're not going to wait for a gift from Washington, D.C., or for this to be handed down by benefactors in the Congress or anywhere else. Like all reform, this has to bubble up from the grassroots. That's where the 4 million people came from who wrote to the FCC in favor of network neutrality over the last year before the FCC vote. So we have to put the brakes on media mergers. We have to start figuring out what kind of model there might be, what kind of incentives, what kind of not-for-profit deals, what kind of public assistance, and so forth there should be for producing the news and information on the media, traditional media and the new media that we are not now getting. While I've got this captive audience for a couple of minutes, I want to talk about one additional thing that can be done right now in order to shine some sunlight, not just in our media, but on our political process. Between now and Election Day, you and I are going to be subject to billions of dollars, a veritable torrent of political ads on TV. And I'm talking about all of those anonymous and nefarious and negative ads brought to you by Citizens for Purple Mountain Majesties and Amber Ways of Grain, or Moms for Furry Kittens and Cuddly Dogs, or whatever it is, names that are masquerading for powerful special interests, and you have no idea what agenda they have. Well, how can you do anything about that, you ask? How can we get a law passed to change that? The good news is you don't need to pass a law. All you need is for the Federal Communications Commission to implement the authority it already has to demand accountability in ads, going back all the way to 1934 when the act was first promulgated. The commission has had authority to compel identification, sponsor identification of all commercial ads and political ads. It shouldn't be allowable that you can get by with Citizens for Purple Mountain Majesties and Amber Ways of Grain, because the law and the FCC rule says you have to identify the true sponsors. And people have a right to know by whom they're trying to be persuaded by, or who's trying to persuade them. And the question of the day is, why does Chairman Wheeler and why does the FCC allow this rampant corruption of our political dialogue instead of exercising the authority that they have right now to implement the law? It should be a no-brainer. Now, obviously it's not, because there are powerful interests on the other side, broadcasters, cable companies, and all the rest. But this is something that we should be able to do, and I would hope that you folks in this audience would join in that pressure to make that happen. I think maybe deep down in his heart of hearts, Chairman Wheeler knows that this is the right thing to do. But whenever you have reform and you're a leader, you want a little encouragement from the grassroots to do it, and I think that's what we need to do here. So I'd ask you to work on that, but let's go back to where we started, on the premise that media is the essential infrastructure of democracy. We have to get it right if any reforms are going to go anywhere, and if we're going to redeem the great promise that is the United States of America. Thanks very much.
Okay. Well, with those two presentations, we're starting to get a picture of what the charge for the media transformation movement is. I use the word transformation because reform is really not enough. It's so broken that we need to do more than reform. We need to transform the media. And we're getting good, clear messages from our previous speakers. And so by the end of this day, I think we'll have a clear picture of what we must do. Our next speaker is one that you'll recognize. He's occasionally even broken through and getting into the corporate mass media, which is not an easy task for people who express progressive ideas. He's known most for his writing, which often appears in The Nation. And I really appreciated his writing about the Wisconsin uprising, because that was the seed. That was one of the seeds, along with the Arab Spring and the Indignado movement in Spain, that led to an awakening in the United States with the Occupy movement, and the movement has actually grown since then. That's one thing you don't hear about in the media, by the way. I would estimate there are about 350,000 people in the Occupy movement. We're probably now at 1.5 million people who are mobilized and active on various fronts. Ralph said in his introduction, it just takes 1% of organized citizens to change things. In fact, he's right. The research over 100 years of movements shows that if 3.5% of the people get active, no government, dictatorship, or democracy can withstand it. You can win at 3.5%, but you can win at less. Our next speaker is helping to build that movement with his writing and his commentary. Please welcome John Nichols.
I'm so glad you're here at Constitution Hall. You know, one of our great challenges with the American Constitution is that some people think it was written in stone and handed down to Michelle Bachmann. But it wasn't. The authors of our Constitution knew that it was an imperfect document, that it was a document that did not begin to anticipate the wholeness of the American experiment that at its best laid out the possibilities of that American experiment. We gather in Constitution Hall not to celebrate the past, but to recognize that every step along the way from 1787 on, we have had new generations of founders who have stepped up to say that we have a right and a responsibility to amend and extend that Constitution, to say that African Americans have a right to vote and a right to be treated as equal citizens in this country, to say that women have a right to vote and to be treated as equal citizens in this country, to say that 18 to 21-year-olds have a right to vote and to decide whether they should be sent off to unnecessary wars, to say, as we did only in 1964, that there should be no wealth barrier to voting when we eliminated the poll tax, and when we should today again amend that Constitution to recognize that voter ID laws are barriers to voting as well. Everyone should have a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted. No, but brothers and sisters, when we speak of founding generations, each new generation of founders, it is important to recognize that we have gathered today in recognition of Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, son of immigrants, son of Connecticut, champion of migrants and refugees, of newcomers, of disempowered people, of consumers and citizens. You know, we never get in the car when my wife doesn't say to my daughter, "Put your seatbelt on, Ralph Nader put it there." And when my wife isn't looking and she bumps into the car in front of her and the airbag blows out, we all say, "Thank God for Ralph Nader." Brothers and sisters, let us recognize that Walt Whitman was right. He said, "Never tip your hat to any man, born or dead." But brothers and sisters, if I had a hat, I would tip it today to the man who called us to this great meeting, the man who called us to this great Constitution Hall, the man who is truly a founder of our time and the times to come, Ralph Nader. So when I travel across this country talking about constitutional issues and talking about freedom of the press, the freedom of the press protection written into that First Amendment, not given us at that initial moment, but 4 years later, when the people demanded that a constitution written to define what leaders might do should also include what people might do. When that freedom of the press protection was written in, I want to remind you, it was not written into the Constitution in anticipation of Rupert Murdoch. It wasn't put there saying, well, you know, we got to make sure that some billionaire can make another billion selling us the latest entertainment, selling us the latest celebrity politics, selling us the latest Donald Trump. That freedom of the press protection was put into the Constitution so that journalists would be free to tell us what the powerful were doing so that we, the people, could engage in democracy and be our own governors, not be governed by others. The freedom of the press protection is a vital protection, yet it has never been fully realized in the American experiment. In the history of this country, we have never fully realized the promise of our freedom of the press protection, because if we had, every citizen would be so fully informed that we would have 100% voter turnout. And I know people in this room, they say, well, 100% voter turnout, that's impossible. You couldn't get 80, 90% turnout. That's unimaginable. In America, we're lucky if we get 50% turnout. We're lucky in local elections if we get 10% turnout. Well, in countries in Europe, they have 70, 80, 90% turnout, well into the 90s. We in America, where we lack a fully realized public broadcasting system, where we lack a fully realized print press, where we lack a fully realized internet with all of its potential, we in America trail the rest of the developed world in voter turnout, and so our freedom of the press protection is not realized because our people are not getting the information easily, accessibly, quickly, and competently in a way that brings them into the process. Our media system today pushes people out of the process. Our media system today tells people not to care, not to engage, to turn away, to entertain themselves to death. And brothers and sisters, that is a crisis in our country. It is not as it has always been. It is true that we never had the media system we should have, that we still aspire to what we need. But understand, it was once better. When I travel across this country talking about free press issues, when I travel across this country talking about democracy issues, I come into a small town, a big city, I go to an antique store, I go to a vintage store, and I look in that store, I say, do you have any of your newspapers from the past? And you know, most of them sell old newspapers. I invite you to do this. Go in any antique store, you go find a pile of old newspapers from the 1960s, 50 years ago, and you pull that newspaper out. Any town in America, a small town in America, a small city in this country, do you know what you're going to find? A newspaper with more information than you could get watching all the cable shows, or reading all the newspapers of today, listening to the radio all day long, even going trolling the internet for an hour. Because 50 years ago, a good daily newspaper, it was heavy, it was thick with information. And on the front page of that newspaper, they didn't have a big picture of whether it snowed the day before. No, on the front page of that newspaper, they had a lot of little articles about all sorts of things. A couple years ago, I went to Duluth, Minnesota. I got a copy of the daily newspaper from 50 years before, roughly 45 years before. On the front page of that newspaper, do you know what was up above the fold as a lead story in the newspaper? Ralph Nader had a press conference in Washington. Now you understand the power of that. If you could have a press conference on an issue of concern to consumers or citizens in Washington, D.C., you put an issue on the table, and that issue goes all across America. People are informed about it in every small town in the country as the main story of that day or one of the main stories of that day. Do you know how quickly that transforms the country? That's what Ralph Nader did in the 1960s. Ralph Nader he isn't some genius. I apologize for saying that. No, Ralph Nader's not some perfect being. Ralph Nader was a committed, engaged citizen at a time when it was possible to put an issue on the table and to have the whole of the country pay attention to that issue. And brothers and sisters, today we are denied that opportunity. People hold press conferences today in Washington, D.C. that are as important as what Ralph Nader talked about 50 years ago. People have rallies in Washington, D.C. and in towns across this country that are as important, raising issues, Black Lives Matter, raising issues, trade policy has to change, raising issues, our military policies have to change, raising issues, our climate change approach must be radically altered so we can save the planet itself. People raising these issues, and yet it doesn't go to the front. It doesn't. I have politicians, they tell me, well, you know, I'd love to talk about that, but the polls show people aren't really that concerned about it. Well, brothers and sisters, If we put it on the front page, if we put it at the front of the news, if we put it on radio every hour, I guarantee you we'd have a solution on climate change in short order. It's a denial of the issue that causes the crisis, not an inability to address it. This is what I come to talk to you about today, because we honor so many people as we gather in this great hall, but let us also honor the memory of Ben Bagdikian. Ben Bagdikian, the great Washington Post writer involved with the Pentagon Papers and so many other struggles in the past to speak truth to power. Ben passed away this year at age, I believe he was 96. I hope I have that right. I know he got to the cusp of 100, and he lived long enough to see Bernie Sanders do okay as a presidential candidate, which he thought was quite an interesting development. But Ben Bagdikian left mainstream media better part of 40 years ago to begin writing about media, because he said, I've been in the belly of the beast. I've done these major things. I have been a part of holding presidents to account, but I see what we have slipping away. I see media becoming less than it was. And he wrote an incredible book in 1983, Media Monopoly, The Media Monopoly, in which he said a handful of corporations, roughly 50 corporations, had come to control the overwhelming majority of our media. Ben Bagdikian kept writing about these issues, kept writing new editions of Media Monopoly, and the number kept going down from 50 to 30 to 20. He ended up, his last edition, he was talking about 6 major corporations controlling the overwhelming majority of our media. But the most important thing that Ben Bagdikian did was that in the 1997 edition of, a new edition of Media Monopoly, he talked about the changing circumstance of newspapers, radio, and television in this country. And what he warned was that with the rise of the internet and with the development of media monopoly as a much more realized challenge, with the greed of the corporations that would control both traditional and new media, that we would see a rapid diminishment of coverage of major issues. Complexity would be pushed to the side. People would say, oh, well, you can find that on the internet. You can go spend hours, work your 2 jobs, get home at 11 o'clock, make sure that your kids are prepared for the next day, and then maybe you can go on the internet and find out what the big issues are and the complexities of them. Because older media is not going to do that anymore. And Ben warned that as this happened, as our media, our major traditional media was diminished and as new media failed to fill the void, that we would see a rapid decline in local governance, that we would have lower turnout in elections, we would have fewer candidates, we would have people not knowing who their city council member was, who their school board member was, who their local representative was, even who their member of Congress was. And I ask you, was Ben Bagdikian right? Did he predict the future 20 years ago? I think he did. I think he warned us of something that was coming. And in fact, as he was writing that, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was passed, making it possible to have massive ownership of radio stations by one company, making it possible for television and other conglomerates to begin to consolidate more and more, beginning to tear apart our cross-ownership rules, all the rules that were put in place that Nick talked about, Nick Johnson, a great hero, talked about on making our media function. All these things ripped up, and what has happened in the last 20 years? There are estimates that tens of thousands, we don't know the precise number, but something in the range of 20,000, some suggest, radio personalities who were once on air doing local media are no longer there, as we've had massive syndication of radio. We have Rush Limbaugh in every town in America, but we have less and less of local news, less and less of that local broadcasting. There are details, we actually know the details, that regional daily newspapers in Seattle, in Denver, in Albuquerque, in Tucson, in Kansas City, Kansas, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, have shut down their print editions and dramatically decreased their newsrooms. Across this country, we have lost tens of thousands of print journalists. And television media, the primary source of our information, the primary source still, local broadcast news, still the primary source for most voters of the information they need. Local broadcast news, they actually now shave minutes off the beginning and the end to fit in more campaign commercials. We wrote about that in our last book. This is an incredible phenomenon. You understand that we have entered into a situation in this country, not just with terrible decline of regulation and control and rules as regards media, but also with the rise of money in politics via Citizens United and a host of other Supreme Court rulings, where we have dialed down the journalism and we have dialed up the advertising. And you know what they call it? You know what they call the advertising in Europe, in Norway, countries like that? Propaganda. We don't do it because that's a gap in our discourse. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody comes on television right before an election and tells you that their opponent is the worst person in the world, and it's with dubious facts, that's not informing the citizenry, that's propaganda. You're seeking to destroy another candidate so that you can get power. And as we have dialed up the money in politics and dialed down the serious journalism that covers us at the local, regional, state, and national level, as Washington bureaus have closed, as international bureaus have closed, we've ended up with the worst of all circumstances. A circumstance in which the only way that you can break through power now, when they're breaking through in the system we must change, is if you're a billionaire celebrity who is on TV a whole bunch. Anybody who tells you that the rise of Donald Trump has something to do with Donald Trump or has something to do with political ideas is not paying attention to the absolute crisis in our media, which covers celebrities over ideas and covers the minutia over the politics that matters. There's a study by a great analyst of TV broadcast. At the end of last year, Media Matters, which does a good job at some of this, brought this up. Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, another group that's done terrific work on this, has brought this out. They looked at how many minutes Donald Trump got during the 2015 period of the campaign. What they found was that on ABC News, according to this study, Donald Trump, who was at the same point in the polls then with Bernie Sanders, they were polling at roughly the same number. Donald Trump's rallies were smaller, Bernie Sanders's were bigger. They found that there was 80 minutes of ABC News devoted to Donald Trump and 1 minute to Bernie Sanders. And then they actually analyzed it, and they found the minute for Bernie Sanders was only 20 seconds. So in our major media today, we have a 240-to-1 ratio of Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders. Now Bernie Sanders broke it through in a lot of ways, but you tell me how different our politics might be if the candidate who's out there actually talking about issues and ideas was getting an equal or even a minimally equal level of coverage. The crisis in our country is now defining our politics. And that's defining democracy itself. So what do we do? Because boy, we can define this crisis. We can tell you every problem that exists. But let me tell you what we must do. Nick was right. In this country, we must recognize that we made a terrible error when we didn't listen to Bill Moyers back in the 1960s when he was advocating for the development of an American BBC, an American public broadcasting system strong enough to cover every aspect of this country and to give us local, state, and national and international news paid for by the people, not by corporate power. We need to supercharge public broadcasting. We need to supercharge community radio and television. We need to get resources to people that are operating in a not-for-profit sector. And brothers and sisters, we need to take seriously the FCC. The FCC has so much power to begin to assert the popular will, and yet it does it so infrequently. I am thrilled that we have had success in the battles for net neutrality, in the battles for some maintenance of controls against cross-ownership by TV, radio, and print corporations. But the fact of the matter is, the FCC could use Section 317 in existing regulations to force those who pay for television ads through all these Americans for Peace and Prosperity and Good Cheese, through all these groups to make them reveal who is paying for those ads. The FCC and our regulatory bodies should be in the forefront of making sure that the people know who's buying our elections. Oh, and brothers and sisters, I hear people all the time, they say, oh, you know, it's just so hard. Everything's gotten so complex with the internet and cable and all these things. And yet we realize that local television is still where people get so much of their information. So why don't we begin to reassert the basic public service premises? If you get a license to print money, and that's what a license to run a local station is, if you get a license to print money, then maybe you should put debates on television in prime time, not on some weekend when nobody's watching. And you know, I've been a working journalist all my life. I don't have much problem with the fairness doctrine. The idea that if somebody is ripped apart, they might have a right to come on and say, hold it, there's another part of that story. The fact of the matter is, the FCC needs to step up in so many ways, and so too does our Congress and our failed Federal Election Commission. There's so much that we can and should do, but there's one thing that we can and should do as citizens, and that is to demand a role in doing what the media companies will not do. And that is to assure that we have the information we need to govern ourselves as citizens. So I put to you today a proposal first surfaced by the great economist Dean Baker, and that is that we ought to have citizenship vouchers in this country. You know, our conservative friends, they all love vouchers. They all want to have vouchers for this and vouchers for that. I'm not sure many of them are good ideas, but I got a citizenship voucher idea that I kind of like. How about this? How about we give every American citizen a voucher for $200, and you can take $200 right off your taxes, and you can use that voucher to support any independent, not-for-profit journalism enterprise that you believe will do a good job in covering what's going on in this country. You want to give your $200 to Amy Goodman so that she can hire a whole crew to go across this country? You can do it. You want to supercharge your community radio station so that it can hire reporters? You can do it. You want to say that in an undercovered neighborhood of a city that has simply been denied coverage as the major media has moved out, you want to say that has to happen? Well, you can go to your local high school and say, hey, that high school radio station's a great station. Let's bring in some of these laid-off journalists from newspapers and radio. Let's bring them in to train these kids, and then let's send these young people out into their community to cover the communities that aren't covered and create great media where we live. Let's use our $200 to make media real for everyone.